Hi, Nick here from Greenspace Zambia. Welcome to my Greenspace. So today I want to talk to you about basically tips on how to grow healthy plants here in Zambia. Our conditions are kind of specific in terms of subtropical conditions that can be found in other parts of the world, but are not widespread so that we cannot necessarily grow everything. So we're just going to kind of go through some of the things that you have to look at when you are then thinking about what to grow and where to grow them. In Zambia, as I said, we have a subtropical climate, so our temperatures are fairly moderate by any means. We don't go below freezing temperatures in most cases, and we get temperatures that can range into the high 20s and into the 30s, definitely at certain times of year. Soil texture. So soil is made up of three components: sand, silt, and clay. And it is the percentage of those components that kind of dictate then what the texture of the soil is going to be. So a very sandy soil is quite gritty. If you try and squeeze the moistened sandy soil in your hands, it doesn't form what they call clods. It breaks apart very easily. So the spaces between those individual soil particles are quite large. They can't kind of clump together, and water will usually drain through that fairly quickly. When you have the other extreme of a lot of clay in a soil, the soil will hold its form when you squeeze it into clods. There's very small spaces between those clay particles, and once they get filled with water, it doesn't allow water to easily then pass through. So in heavy clay soils, you tend to have them being usually very waterlogged if there is a heavy rainfall event. And it can lead to issues of flooding and inundation, which then, depending on plants, is not good for them either. The acidity of the soil is something we should also take into account. Things growing in certain areas like pine forests, and even actually quite a bit of our soils here within Zambia and in Africa in general, are quite acidic. They're highly leached from our rainfall, which then plants have adapted to growing in those conditions. So things like gardenias, pine trees from northern hemispheres, those are quite acidic plants. Even the rhododendrons and the azaleas, these plants have adapted to growing in quite acidic conditions, and they won't like growing in more neutral or even what they call basic. So that's when the pH is above 7 and you have more kind of calcium within the soil. Our groundwater here in Zambia is quite basic. It has quite a lot of calcium in it. So sometimes you might also notice that when you're watering your plants, especially in the dry season, sometimes a little white crust can kind of form over the surface of the soil, and that's what happens when you're watering with the groundwater, and as it evaporates, it leaves the calcium. And that will slowly affect the acidity of the soil, raising it. And in some cases, those plants will not do very well because they don't like basic soils. In that kind of sense, you can remedy it by using rainwater instead. So if you could store enough rainwater, you could then be able to water that and not worry about increasing the pH of your soil beyond what the plants enjoy. We also then have issues of how much precipitation would fall in an area. When you look at deserts and proper desert plants, they have adapted to really low rainfall. So something like in the Namib Desert or even parts of the Kalahari, which is not quite a desert in the conventional sense, but is a very dry woodland type within southern Africa here. Those plants have adapted to very low amounts of rainfall, usually adapting in some ways. Some of them form more succulent stems or leaves, and these which would be called succulent plants. So when you look at something like the baobab, which is a very large succulent tree, it stores its water in the stems. Then we've got things like the Sansevieria, although they've now been reclassified as Dracaena, but we'll talk about that later. Sansevieria have quite succulent leaves. So they store as much water in their leaves and partly in the underground rhizomes that they have as well. So these are kind of adaptations that these plants have employed to be able to adapt to their location. In more kind of rainforest locations where there can be rain almost throughout the year and sometimes very heavy rains during certain periods of the year, plants have adapted slightly different. So they might actually grow on stilts. So there are some plants that have adapted to kind of come up and grow down, or grow roots that come up to allow them to still breathe in exchange for oxygen in waterlogged soils. Some of them have adapted very thin leaves that are able to shed as much moisture through the leaf as possible as it happens. So something like this Spathiphyllum or peace lily has quite thin leaves. It likes quite a bit more humidity around it by comparison to the Sansevieria. And in dry conditions will lose a lot more water, and you get the browning edges to the leaves, which is an indication of a bit of water stress on these plants. Humidity then also tends to make a difference as well. So obviously in a rainforest setting, the humidity is much higher. Plants won't have to worry too much about losing as much water through the leaves because there's a lot more humidity around it. And in that case, they generally have adapted to ideally requiring higher humidity, whereas something like succulent plants in low humidity scenarios don't want too much high humidity. And when there is high humidity, what you might find is that on the actual leaves themselves, they start to develop rotting patches, or even fungal issues can become problematic in those cases. So in terms of trying to figure out what you can best grow in your garden or even in your home, it's best to try and understand the origins of the plants that we then grow. In Zambia, we can grow quite a few things that then come from subtropical climates, and this includes parts of Asia, South America, where our conditions mimic those there, although there will obviously be slight differences. When it comes to then plants from vastly different areas, say from temperate areas like in Europe or North America, some of those plants will struggle much more in growing in Zambia because there's going to be certain things that they don't experience there that we have here. So our long period of dry season, usually from about April through to November, is a big factor upon which a lot of plants have to be adapted to in order to thrive in Zambia. So, with that, I would always advise to do a bit of research regarding the plants that you want to grow, see if they're more suited to Zambia. If they are, by all means, you can try them out. If they thrive, great. If they don't, you might have to readjust the conditions that you then have them growing in to see if you can't get them to grow better. There are going to be some plants that we just don't really have the ability to grow in Zambia. Things like tulips or daffodils, a lot of the temperate bulbs will not grow well in Zambia because we don't have the cold periods. You could try putting them in the freezer and then bringing them out. However, over time, these plants will still generally tend to decline. It's going to be difficult. However, I don't want to stop anybody from trying. So, you know, if it's worth it to you, give it a try and hopefully you succeed. But otherwise, easiest to try growing those things that we know grow in similar climates to ours.